William Wilberforce, A Force for Freedom. William Wilberforce was born in Kingston upon Hull in Yorkshire County in 1759. The city is often just called Hull, and Hull, Quebec was named after this city. William's grandfather grew wealthy through Baltic trade and was also Hull's mayor twice. His son, William's father, followed in his business-minded footsteps. This is the house where he was born. It is now a museum in tribute to his life. Wilberforce walked to and from the local grammar school for 2 years. When William was 8 years old, his father died, and he was then placed in the care of his Aunt Hannah and Uncle William Wilberforce. They were wealthy Methodists who had nonconformist tendencies. His Aunt Hannah was the sister of John Thornton, one of Europe's richest men at the time, who was a patron of George Whitefield and John Newton, a former slave ship captain turned minister and writer of the hymn Amazing Grace. At about age 12, he returned home, as his mother didn't want him influenced by Methodist leanings. At age 17, in 1776, he began attending St. John's College, Cambridge, and while there he was a bit of a party boy, popular and jovial, and became friends with the future Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger. By throwing a birthday party for himself, complete with an ox roast, he secured nearly all the votes in the election of 1780 to become the MP for Hull. Curiously, Wilberforce's arts degrees from Cambridge were initially withheld because he refused to assent to the Articles of the Church of England. They were eventually awarded in 1781 and 1788. From 1780 to 1784, Wilberforce continued with politics as usual and became MP for Yorkshire County in 1784. But his life would begin to change in October of 1784. Along with family, Wilberforce traveled to the continent for a pleasure trip, arriving at Nice, France on November 30th and staying until February 3rd. He had invited along his acquaintance Isaac Milner for company. Milner was a brilliant man and professor of math and chemistry at Cambridge. In the course of their travels, Wilberforce came to realize the authenticity of Milner's Christian faith, and the two shared many spiritual conversations. The two also read Doddridge's book, Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul, which proved pivotal in Wilberforce's embracing of Christianity. Wilberforce continued in Bible study and honest prayer, and also sought counsel from his friends, including John Newton. Wilberforce took communion on Good Friday, 1786, marking a 1.5-year-long journey to faith. This great change would change the focus of his life forever. Rather than leave politics to pursue a Christian life elsewhere, Wilberforce was encouraged to work out his faith by being faithful as a change maker in political life. He is most famous for his work as an abolitionist. He would fight within the British House of Commons for nearly 20 years for the abolishment of the slave trade in the British colonies, and for many years after that, for emancipation. Slavery fueled the economic viability and growth of Britain's colonies in the Caribbean. Boats would leave Britain for the west coast of Africa, procure their human cargo through kidnapping and force, and travel across the Atlantic to the colonies, the voyage known as the Middle Passage. The slaves would then be traded for goods that were desired back in Britain, sugar, cotton, and tobacco. As Wilberforce came to understand, the lives of slaves was hellish. They had no rights, were abused, tortured, and treated as non-persons, and often took their own lives in protest or desperation. In 1789, Wilberforce gave his first speech to the House of Commons on 12 propositions for the abolishment of slavery. In 1791, he introduced the first parliamentary bill for the abolishment of slavery, which was defeated. He continued to support motions to abolish slavery in every parliamentary session until finally, in 1807, the Act for the Abolishment of the Slave Trade was passed, though the trade continued illegally and internationally. He did live to hear that the Slavery Abolition Act would be passed in Parliament in 1833. Even in retirement, he had campaigned for abolition and emancipation. It must be said that though Wilberforce is famous for spearheading the British abolishment of slavery, he was certainly not the pioneer of the movement, but a spokesperson and ally of it. Wilberforce did not work alone, but in collaboration with many others who carried the same vision. The Quakers were actively opposing slavery and petitioning government long before Wilberforce's conversion. Granville Sharp was an abolitionist who was the first to publish and circulate an anti-slavery tract in 1769. Thomas Clarkson was perhaps his most famous and important collaborator. Clarkson was the primary researcher who traveled and investigated conditions on the slaving ships and life in the colonies, and he furnished this evidence to Wilberforce to educate Parliament of slavery's horrors. In 1787, Wilberforce began working with Sharp, Clarkson, and others in the Society for Abolition of the Slave Trade to muster support and coordinate their efforts for public education and parliamentary influence. In 1792, Wilberforce moved to the Clapham neighborhood outside of London, where many of his Anglican allies lived. Together they formed a social group that met regularly and developed several societies to promote moral change and social justice. They were criticized with the title The Clapham Sect. To better illustrate this collaborative effort, here is a hard-to-read but appropriate illustration by Thomas Clarkson. Wilberforce is represented here by this stream, one of many that joined together to create the momentum needed to change the cultural and political ideas of their day. It is a map of influencers, those who contributed to the eventual abolition of slavery. On the left are the names of those in Europe. On the right are the rivers of the American abolition movement, and in the center are the Quakers with George Fox at the top. Granville Sharp also figures prominently in this stream, and Thomas Clarkson is also present over here. While Wilberforce's social circle in Clapham carried out their mission of social justice through educating the public, Wilberforce used his voice and position in Parliament to activate change in policy. In 1790, the year after Wilberforce's first anti-slavery speech in Parliament, a special committee was set up to consider evidence regarding the trade. Wilberforce consistently presented evidence gathered by Thomas Clarkson and others, showing the cruelty to slaves in their transport and their servitude, like this diagram of the density of enslaved passengers aboard the ship Brooks. Slavery was debated in every session of Parliament from 1791 until the trade to the British colonies was finally made illegal in 1807, after a 9-hour debate. The main strategy Wilberforce and others used in accomplishing their goal of freedom and equality for people was to challenge people's errant perceptions with a stark picture of the vicious reality of the slavery system. Let's do an exercise to illustrate this point. Here is a watercolor called The Mill Yard, done in 1823 by William Clark. It shows a soft, busy scene of a sugar cane mill in Antigua, where the workers are well-clothed, seemingly well-fed, and cooperative. The drawing was part of a series of 10 depicting life in the West Indies. Now contrast that with The Slave Trade, painted in 1833 by François-Auguste Biard, which now hangs in the Wilberforce House in Hull. Upon reflection, this painting shows many of the horrors of the trade. This man holds a torture device. This child sits motherless. This woman is restrained and a victim of the practice of human branding. This is called a cat of nine tails whip, the usual device used to coerce slaves to comply on the ships. This man and his group are bound together by the neck. Slaves were often tied together for the duration of their voyages across the Atlantic. This man is restrained by a large, heavy log, also a common practice, while the supervisor looks on, smugly, in charge of the inventory of human cargo with his gun at the ready, and it seems that this man, who was bound by a braided rope, has already died. This was the reality of the trade that Britain was involved in, the trade that Wilberforce pledged his life to end. Wilberforce was also a prolific writer, his most well-known work being A Practical View of the Prevailing Religious System of Professed Christians in the Higher and Middle Classes in this Country Contrasted with Real Christianity. Usually it's just called A Practical View of Christianity. It was published in 1797. This was a calling out of sorts of the hypocrisy of those who called themselves Christians without any action to back it up. Wilberforce also got married the same year. He also wrote several lengthy letters to educate the public on and advocate for the abolishment of the slave trade, including a 498-page letter to his constituents in 1807, an 83-page letter to the French foreign minister in 1814, and a 77-page appeal to the entire British populace in 1823. Aside from these and other letters, Wilberforce also kept a detailed journal. It is also of note that many of the parliamentary proceedings regarding slavery, including the evidence presented, are recorded in detail and available online. Wilberforce's advocacy extended beyond human rights. He was also concerned for the ethical treatment of animals, which were at the time used for cruel sports like bull baiting and cockfighting and often abused in farm labor. This was a growing concern among the collective conscience of society, and an anti-cruelty act called Martin's Law had been passed in 1822. In 1824, just 2 years before his retirement, Wilberforce joined a meeting of various reformers who had established the world's first animal welfare charity, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or SPCA as we know it. That same year, it brought 63 offenders before the courts with charges. This painting shows the trial of Bill Burns, who was charged with beating his donkey. The donkey was brought in as evidence. The group would go on to lobby government and influence new anti-cruelty laws. Wilberforce chose to speak up for those with no voice. Wilberforce retired from Parliament in 1825 due to failing health, after he had passed on leadership of the fight for emancipation in Parliament to Lord Buxton. He spent his retirement visiting friends, reading, writing letters, and attending Emancipation Society meetings. He died in London on July 29, 1833. He was almost 74 years of age. Just 3 days before his death, he heard the report that the Slavery Abolition Act would definitely be passed. His funeral was attended by immense crowds, including commoners and politicians, and he is buried in the north transept of Westminster Abbey near his friend William Pitt. Aside from his personal writings, which are widely reprinted, Wilberforce was and remains a popular biographical subject. His sons, Robert Isaac and Samuel, wrote a 5-volume memoir of their father's life and published it in 1838, less than 5 years after his death. An abridged version was published in 1843. Less than 20 years later, in 1861, another biography, The Slave's Champion by Henry Wheeler, was published to mark the 100 years since Wilberforce's birth. In recent history, many biographies have been written about him, and he is considered a key figure in the history of Christianity. In 2007, a feature film was made about his life titled Amazing Grace. In addition to his literary legacy, Wilberforce is remembered in numerous educational and cultural institutions. In Hull, there are memorials to him, including this pillar, and next to the Wilberforce House Museum stands this building, the Oriel Chambers, which is home to the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation. On the grounds stands also this memorial. In the same spirit of Thomas Clarkson's river diagram, it acknowledges many fighters for freedom and truth who have stood together to make change in the world. Wilberforce's name is accompanied by some of his friends and many other notable figures. I will leave you with a quote from Wilberforce's speech in the House of Commons from 1791, at the start of his fight against the slave trade. "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again, that you did not know. Thank you for your attention today.